Hey there, dear friends, it's Pancake. Convicts are often imprisoned for no good reason. This happens quite often in the modern world. Often it doesn't even require proof to put someone in jail. An unfair term in prison can lead to mental and physical imbalance in people, which further leads to irreversible consequences. How long can an ordinary healthy person live without food and drink? Without food but in the presence of fluids for a long time, several months, but a completely dry hunger strike, as it is believed after 3 days, can lead, if not to death, then to irreversible health consequences. Let's find out the stories of people who were abandoned in a cell and forgotten about them for many, many years. In fact, there are cases of survival of people who have been deprived of food and water for a longer time. And the record, which hardly anyone wants to repeat voluntarily, belongs to an 18-year-old Austrian named Andreas Mikovets. On April 1st, 1979, a young man was driving with a friend in a car through the streets of the small town of Host, where about 7,000 people lived. Suddenly, another car drove into them. No one was injured, but Mikovets' friend was under a degree. The police arrived and took the guys to the police station. The drunk driver was sent for examination, and Andreas, who had no documents, decided to detain him until the morning. 3 policemen locked the guy in the only cell in the basement of the building. Previously, cider was stored here, and now they have put 2 bunk beds and a plastic bucket for waste products. Delay until morning stretched for a long 18 days. Several factors coincided at once. In quiet and peaceful Austria, it is not so often that offenders are arrested. Andreas was the only one. In the following days, no other detainees were added, so the employees had no reason to go down to the basement. Each of the 3 policemen coming to work the next morning decided that his partner had already released yesterday's detainee. At least that's what they claimed later at the trial. It is possible that lazy and not particularly zealous Austrian policemen simply forgot about the man in the cell. They were not even confused by the fact that Andreas' mother came to the station several times and tried to find out the fate of her son. Andreas Mikovets did not give a single interview after the incident, and therefore we can only imagine what the young man thought in the first days, while the brain was still working. Why doesn't anyone come? Why can't anyone hear my screams and knocks? Where are all the people? What is there on the surface? A nuclear war? A zombie invasion? Or an apocalypse? However, according to scientists, after 3 or 4 days he could hardly think about anything. Andreas was discovered on April 18th accidentally. One of the employees of the station felt an unpleasant smell coming from the basement and decided to check. Having descended, I found the lifeless body of a man. For several weeks, the unfortunate guy's condition was on the verge. At any moment, the kidneys and heart could fail. But Andreas survived despite everyone. However, I lost 25 kg of weight. The most incredible thing is that he didn't become disabled and didn't earn a single chronic illness. About a year later, 2 trials took place. At the first, criminal police officers accused of negligence were fined, if translated to modern prices, 2,000 euros each. For Austria, a country with high salaries, the amount is negligible. No one was fired. At the second trial, civil, Andreas Mikovets sued the authorities for compensation of 250,000 Austrian shillings, which today, taking into account inflation, is a little more than 18,000 euros. A ridiculous amount for modern lawsuits. The hero of this story lived quietly and peacefully in his hometown of Bregenz. Andreas had problems with the law. Sometimes he was even called a gangster in the press. Maybe that's why he avoided journalists. In the early 2010s, he was still alive. Nothing is known about him today. But the question arises, how and why did Andreas survive, contrary to the claims of scientists? Firstly, the cool temperature in the basement slowed down the dehydration process. Secondly, he could get moisture from condensation on the stone walls of the basement. It is also known that the guy tried to unsuccessfully gnaw the leather belt from his jeans. In 1997, the Guinness Book of Records recognized Andreas Mikovets as the record holder for survival without food and water. The record still holds. Sometimes even a stable and proven system can fail. A court decision may turn out to be erroneous, and an innocent person is locked up in prison for a crime he didn't commit. There are many terrible examples in history when an innocent person spent half his life in prison because of the mistakes of the investigation. And before we continue, we recommend that you like and write what you think about it. We are very interested in your opinion. Justification in Poland. In 2018, a young man, Tomasz Komenda, who had served 18 years in prison at the time, was acquitted in Poland. He was accused of murdering a 15-year-old girl in the small town of Miloshice. The tragedy occurred on New Year's Eve. Last time the girl was seen in a coma by 2 men that left the club drunk. The culprit in the murder could not be found for a long time until one of the witnesses pointed to Thomas. It seemed to him that the guy's appearance fits the description. As a result of the examination, the investigation investigation determined the suspect and Thomas was found guilty of murder, despite the fact that about 10 people confirmed that the young man celebrated the holiday at home with friends. During the trial, Thomas was found guilty. All the following years turned out into a real nightmare for him. In prison, he tried to commit suicide several times out of desperation, but his mother didn't give up and continued to seek the truth. Only a few years later, the case was resumed and an examination was reconducted, which showed the past studies were erroneous. As a result, the investigation came to the trail of the real criminal, who appeared earlier as a witness. The case in China. Let's go to China. Here in 2014, a man who was executed 18 years ago for the murder of a woman was posthumously acquitted. A young man, Hu Ji, in 1996, together with a friend, found a woman's body in a public toilet and immediately contacted the police. As a result, he himself was accused of murder and sentenced to death. A few months after the trial, the guy was shot. Only in 2005, a man, a serial killer, was detained who pleaded guilty to the murder of that very woman. The court resumed and reviewed the case, admitted his mistake, and acquitted Hu Ji posthumously. As an apology, the authorities paid the family of the innocent victim compensation in the amount of $330,000. After that, the guy's mother burned a copy of the guilty verdict on his grave. A similar case occurred in 2016 in China, 21 years after the execution. Not Shubing was acquitted. The guy was shot in 1995 for a crime he didn't commit. The basis for the conviction was the confession of a young man. Only later it turned out that the confession was obtained illegally, forced out by force. The truth was revealed only in 2015 when a man aged 47 was detained in another case. He confessed to committing a crime for which an innocent man was executed. As a result, the court recognized the mistake and issued an acquittal posthumously. The loss of relatives and moral damage were estimated at $400,000 in compensation. The Russian has achieved an acquittal. Evgeny Vadanin, a resident of Tatarstan in Russia, managed to achieve the largest compensation and an apology from the court. When he was 25 years old, he was convicted of the murder of the head of the security service of the Tatneft oil company, Alexander Kalakin, in 2001. In his interview, Evgeny shared that he had an iron alibi, but despite this, law enforcement officers forcibly beat confessions out of him. The main motive of the crime was revenge for the fact that the guy was not hired. As a result, he was locked up in a strict regime colony where he spent 4 years. Evgeny was lucky. Again was detained in St. Petersburg, whose members confessed to the murder of the head of the Tatneft security service. Eugene was found not guilty and acquitted 4 years later. For the lost years of his life, the young man sued the authorities for 1 million rubles and obtained an official apology from the court. But representatives of the local police never apologized to Vadanin. The judge himself was not found guilty. His actions were recognized as erroneous. France. False testimony. A terrible case occurred in France. French farmer Loic Sacker spent 7 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He was accused of violent acts of harassment of a minor. The main witness was the victim herself, a girl at the age of 14. A black streak began for the farmer. In prison, he repeatedly declared hunger strikes and tried to commit suicide. Many years later, the grown-up girl admitted that she had invented everything and there was no crime. In fact, there was. In 2012, the man was acquitted and paid him compensation in the amount of 800,000 euros. An interesting fact is that initially they wanted to sentence Loic to a life sentence. During the time spent in prison, his house and land were taken away from him. Relatives and friends turned away from him. As for the girl herself, she was convicted after confessing and forced to return 60,000 euros that she received from the local social fund as a victim of a crime. Forgotten in the cell for 2 years. American Steven Slavin was arrested for drunk driving in 2005. While waiting for the hearing, 59-year-old Steven Slavin spent 22 months in a solitary cell in New Mexico State Prison due to the fact that he was simply forgotten about. The man was in the cell all this time in conditions of terrible, unsanitary conditions. Due to the lack of a shower, the skin of his legs was affected by fungus, and the unfortunate man had to pull out his sick teeth himself since the prison administration ignored his request to call a doctor. However, all these torments are not the most terrible ordeal that he had to endure. Doctors diagnosed him with incurable lung cancer. And despite the fact that the man was cleared of all charges and released, he has about a year left to live. However, Steven Slavin won the court in this case and received one of the largest compensations in the United States among prisoners, $15.5 million. Only now a person will not return his life and health for this money. All people should receive fair justice, but sometimes it can be unfair. Firstly, the law may be ambiguous or unreasonable for formal reasons. For example, a judge may make a decision taking into account not all available information or based on personal preferences. Secondly, even in conditions of transparency and proper application of the law, people's rights may be violated. Lawless arrest, especially without evidence, or prolonged detention without trial, can occur even in countries with a thriving justice system. These can lead to people being wrongly convicted and placed in detention cells for no reason. Therefore, it is important to monitor the fairness of justice and fight for human rights, especially in cases where legislation contradicts an honest and fair procedure. 4 days in prison, $4 million. Student Daniel Chon, who almost died in solitary confinement in an American prison due to the negligence of investigators who forgot about his existence for almost 5 days, has achieved substantial compensation. He became a millionaire, but at what cost? The lawsuit between Chong's lawyers and the Office for the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration in San Diego lasted almost a year. The young man was going to sue the department for $20 million, but in the end the parties agreed on $4.1 million in compensation for physical and moral damage. Daniel couldn't imagine what the party on the occasion of the 420 holiday, the so-called Day of Marijuana Lovers, which these same lovers in the United States informally celebrate on April 20, would turn out for him. Just that day, the San Diego police raided local drug dealers. It is not clear to the end what Chong had to do with the drug dealer's den, where he was taken in a company of 9 people. Anyway, in this place, the police found a batch of 18,000 ecstasy pills and a warehouse with trunks. For questioning, the detainees were taken to a suburb of San Diego, where the Office of the Drug Enforcement Administration is located. There, one guy was released, and according to Chong, they were going to do the same to him for lack of guilt. They even kindly promised to give him a lift home in a police car, but instead, for some reason, they were taken to solitary confinement, and there, they forgot. For more than 4 days, Chong spent locked in a 3 by 1.5 meter cell without windows, handcuffed, without food and water. By his own admission, he had to drink his own urine in order not to die. He heard voices outside the door and shouted at the top of his voice, but in vain. On the 3rd day, the young man began to hallucinate. He smashed his glasses and swallowed several pieces in order to end the torment as soon as possible. Employees of the department found an almost lifeless body. A young man with convulsions and almost failed kidneys was sent to the hospital, where he spent 3 days in intensive care. Scary, all these people lost the best years of their lives, went through all the circles of hell in prison, and society turned away from them. The judicial system is not perfect. Any of you can be accused of a crime that you didn't commit, or force out confessions. We recommend you to like and subscribe to the channel so we can release more cool videos on different topics. In the meantime, there was still a pancake with you. Good mood and fair wind to everyone. See you soon.